Hey guys, this is Pablo with Meditation Amsterdam. Today we get to make the 8th video in the book series The Pearl Beyond Price, in which I have been analyzing this book by A.H. Almaas. If you want to see some of the previous episodes or watch the series that I've created so far, it sits under the Pearl Beyond Price playlist on the channel. Another little announcement for those of you who are native Spanish speakers: I've created a separate YouTube channel called El Buda que Ayuda, and I'm making one-to-one the same episodes as of last week in Spanish as I make it English. So if you want to watch those in your mother tongue, that's the channel to go for. And it might make it also easier to share with friends and family in case you think some of this content is cool for you. And in today's episode, I want to talk about a very interesting subject actually that Almaas goes into. We've talked about his take on how ego is formed, about the role of let's say disassociation that the ego plays in adult life. And now we go into a chapter that he calls autonomic regulation. And I think this chapter is really interesting based on my own philosophy on personal cultivation or self-cultivation. And it's a theme that I've touched on before, but I believe that it is really well captured here in the book. And to start with, I will read a quote or two from Almaas, and then I want to dive into the topic in a little bit more detail. So the quote says as such. He says, "Its real significance," and he's talking about the presence of being in your life, "its real significance is not exactly to remove suffering, but to lead to the truth by providing the capacity to tolerate suffering. This increased tolerance for emotional suffering gives the individual the ability to refrain from ego defenses. This allows one to look objectively at one's experience, which facilitates its metabolism. It eliminates suffering in a more ultimate and fundamental sense by allowing the ability to see the deeper causes of suffering." Then he has a couple of small little quotes which I underline that says, "To just be instead of trying to manipulate, to be who one is a compassionate act." And then comes another very important quote, and all of these are placed in the context of having our identity sit in being instead of the ego. And he says, "More objectively speaking, joy manifests when there is fulfillment, but there is no lasting fulfillment as long as there is any aspect of being not realized. One cannot seek happiness, for it is the result of realizing the truth with a capital T. The personality," he's talking about egoic identification now, "which has security and pleasure as its aims, cannot be happy. Pursuing pleasure or safety will entail covering up any unpleasant or frightening truths." So you will immediately recognize that some of the themes that are being touched upon here are themes that I've discussed in several other videos in the channel. One of them I touched upon very recently under the topic of how very often when people reach out for spiritual advice or spiritual techniques, what they are seeking for is a way to feel better. In other words, they want good emotions, they want good experiences, and they want their life to essentially take a turn for the better, let's say. But that better is defined in egoic terms, meaning I want more safety, more pleasure, more predictability, more security. And what Almas is showing us here is that what we often find when we start to do serious spiritual work is that there's a lot of bitter to be eaten. And we really don't like that, because we're identified with an egoic self that is seeking pleasure and comfort and security. So as we start to mature in our spiritual understanding of how the whole thing works, we come to realize that any orientation towards good emotions, good experiences, and improving the way we take action, improving the way in which we think, are all necessarily coming from the ego, because the ego wants only to reside in the warm side of the pool. It doesn't like the cold side of the pool. And whereas awareness and the expression of our full being needs to encompass both. So when we start to become more serious about spiritual work, we come to realize that we need to eat a lot of bitter, that we need to sit a lot with really distressing emotions, very visceral, negative emotions such as shame, such as guilt, such as vulnerability, such as hopelessness. And that to the degree that we are able to sit with those, something very interesting starts to happen, which is what Almas mentions here at the very beginning of that quote. Our capacity to tolerate those emotions starts to grow over time. And to the degree that our capacity to tolerate negative emotions grows, we find it less necessary to employ egoic defense mechanisms, of which projection and disassociation are the primary mechanisms. We find it less necessary to engage in those egoic tactics to preserve our egoic syntony, or to, in less technical terms, make ourselves feel better. To not have to face any of these emotions that I mentioned, and to not have to face cognitive dissonance, which arises when two different parts of ourselves enter into conflict with one another. So when that happens, the ego springs to life and it starts to project to the outside, or essentially go inside into a fantasy land of disassociation and overthinking. And that means that we are not really in a spiritual endeavor trying to make ourselves feel better in the way ego believes that we ought to feel better. We are there to have not a better life, but a life that is more complete, and which encompasses all the full spectrum. Makes me think a little bit of the second, the sequel of the movie Dune, in which the mother of Paul Atreides, Lady Jessica, drinks the water of life, which makes you see the full spectrum of reality. And she offers the water of life to Paul so that he can become the one, he can awaken. And she says, you must drink the water of life to see the beauty and the horror. And what that means is you get full spectrum view of what reality is about. You don't just get to pick and choose, because picking and choosing is of an egoic concern. You would only need to pick and choose if you want things to pan out in a certain way. But for awareness is not interested in picking and choosing. Awareness, which is your true nature or your core self, wants to experience the full gamut of experience, including the really nasty parts. It's also interesting because in our efforts to self-improve or to follow a spirituality that makes us better or nicer or whatever you name it, we often become very reluctant to navigate into the shadow. I was having a very interesting session yesterday with someone, and that person was sharing a line of thought in which the world seems to offer no authenticity, and so it's not really worth engaging with people because they usually have some sort of agenda. And that person was in a very authentic way asking my take on that line of thought, which feels very real. to them. And I said, well, to my mind, that sounds like there's a projection of your shadow to the world. You have not quite come to terms with the fact that there's a lot of darkness and sneakiness and lack of authenticity within, and therefore you project it out there, and it's all that you can see, and everybody is, you know, people trying to trick you and so on. Now, on a practical level, you don't want to take away from the fact that, you know, half the world is probably trying to trick you. But the question is, does that mean that you need to hate on it and not engage with it, right? Like that's where that extra step of the therefore I'm not gonna, or therefore I'm gonna, that therefore is unwarranted. You could simply state it as a statement of fact to say, well, there's a lot of trickiness and lack of authenticity out there, or there seems to be. And there's no therefore, because therefore implies that you're trying to obtain a certain result or disassociate, or have it as a warranted move to therefore hate on the world. And that's where identification and projection start to play a role that is not really what's going on there. So I guess that's the main gist of today's video. Is I wanted to share this insight, this notion of how our spiritual work is to improve the bandwidth of experience that we can stomach, and that in improving that, the more discomfort we can sustain, the more we can actually engage with life in a fuller way without the need for tactical egoic actions or thoughts that are aimed at preserving our view of ourselves and making us feel or think that we're gonna end up always on top of things and with the right quote-unquote kind of results. As usual, I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on this one, so do share them in the comment section if you think it's worth it. And if you believe that this is the kind of content that other people can benefit from, then your liking, sharing, and subscribing makes the channel ever more available to others, and I'm always super grateful and motivated by your participation in the channel. I'll be back with more videos pretty soon. Until then, cheerio. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.